Hi, everyone. Today I want to talk to you about a study that I'm currently preparing on the Book of the Dead, specifically spells 51 and 52, and thinking about these spells through assemblage theory and remix culture. And I came to this research through a particular papyrus that's currently in the Getty Museum, the Book of the Dead papyrus of Pa-Sher Ashakhet. And that's really where the research for this paper began, is my ongoing work on this papyrus in Los Angeles. Pa-Sher Ashakhet's papyrus is a late dynastic or early Ptolemaic period Book of the Dead papyrus currently in the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. The papyrus scroll consists of 23 sheets of papyrus joined together approximately every 12 centimeters. 2.5 centimeters of the first leading columns are missing, and the final sheet breaks off after 11 centimeters. The top of the manuscript is lost throughout, but based on parallel manuscripts, only 3 to 6 centimeters of text are missing at the top. It was written in columns of cursive hieroglyphs with a selection of Book of the Dead spells following the so-called Sayite recension, or sequence, but with many omissions from the 165 spells known from papyri like EUF in Turin, from where we get our modern spell numbers through Lepsius. The sequence of spells I will be discussing later in this talk are highlighted on the screen in gold. The papyrus belonged to a man named Pa-Sher Ashakhet, who held the title of doorkeeper of Khonsu in Thebes Neferhotep, placing him in the larger Karnak temple administration. His mother had the name Ta-Bear and the title head of the house. The papyrus ultimately derived through the collections of Sir Thomas Phillips via a gift to the Getty by Mr. and Mrs. H.P. Krause in 1983. High-resolution images are available through the Getty's online collection search at the link on the screen. The papyrus has been treated by Malcolm Mosher as part of his publication project on the Book of the Dead, Sayite through Ptolemaic periods, where it appears among what he calls the early hieroglyphic set as source Getty D. As Mosher's work is a collective study, it does not contain a continuous discussion of this papyrus, but extensive references and textual notes can be found under the treatment of individual spells. Mosher notes the difficulty in dating this manuscript, citing the work of Thomas Mekis, who suggested that it may be late dynastic, thus pre-Ptolemaic. But in a later volume of the series, Mosher suggests that, quote, that Getty D should be dated similar to that of Turin 1791, possibly late 3rd or early 2nd century. A complete edition of the papyrus with introduction, transcription, transliteration, translation, and brief commentary will appear in the catalog of Book of the Dead manuscripts from the Getty that I am currently working to complete. During my research preparing the catalog edition for Pa-Sher Ashakhet's papyrus, I noted some interesting features of Book of the Dead spells 51 and 52, both general features, but also with respect to Pa-Sher Ashakhet's specific papyrus. In general, these two spells are interesting because both of them contain the same exact text, at least partially. Spell 51 is simply repeated at the beginning of spell 52, where that section of text is then expanded by additional material added at the end. Here you can see the two spells side by side from their Ptolemaic version, again from the papyrus of EUF. Spell 51 has the incipit title, Spell for Not Walking Upside Down in the Realm of God, while spell 52 has the incipit title, Spell of Not Eating Feces in the Realm of God. Following the note of recitation by the owner, the Jedmenu Yin so-and-so, the body of the spell is nearly identical in both cases, at least at the beginning, as I'll show you here in 1 second. For the sake of illustrating for you the parallels between the two spells, here is spell 51, highlighted in blue, and spell 52, highlighted in red, from Lepsius's edition of the papyrus of EUF. We can follow the identical parallels throughout the spells. Here highlighted in blue, and you'll notice the highlights will follow along with the text so you can see how similar, in fact, nearly identical, that the two spells are. Both texts begin with But E Sepsin, so my abomination, maybe with exclamation point for the Zepsin there. Then they continue Nen winem ec, I will not eat it. Followed by, again, boot ipu hesu. So feces is my abomination. And then a repetition again, nen winem ec, I will not eat it. So those first few passages are exactly parallel in both spells. Then, after the introductory phrases, there is a slight difference between the two spells. However, in many manuscripts, the difference itself is rather revealing. Both texts use hetep ka as a euphemism for excrement. Note that in spell 51, the first person pronoun e for my is used. But then a second person plural variant, 10, here on the screen, 10, is marked by kijed. So it's marked as a variant. That is my variant, your. It is exactly this variant, 10, plural, second person, that is found in version of spell 52, which further suggests that spell 52 was a reworking of spell 51 that simply incorporated this variant into the spell. After this variant, the two texts once again sync up with two final passages, nin ari ref im awi e, I will not touch it with my hands, and the parallel phrase, in chened ini heref im chepti e, I do not tread upon it with my sandals. And here you would expect in other manuscripts, nin chened e, so the negative future, but here we have nin plus sejum inf, and I'm taking this as negation of present, in nin for in chened ini, I do not tread upon it with my sandals. This is where spell 51 comes to an end. However, spell 52 was expanded by adding a long passage following this section that was identical to spell 51. This helps to illustrate how new religious compositions could be formed by ancient Egyptian scribes. They often repeated, glossed, or expanded on material at hand to produce quote-unquote new texts. When we look then at the bigger picture, we see that the beginning of spell 52 is nothing other than a repetition of spell 51. And you can see on the screen that we have spell 51 outlined in blue fill with yellow outline. The identical part of spell 52 that matches spell 51 in blue outline, blue fill, and then green outline, red fill for the additional material that spell 52 added at the end. So we can see that the beginning of spell 52 is nothing other than a repetition of spell 51. We can see that spell 52 is distinguished from spell 51 by its final elaboration, and that spell 52 was assembled, let's put that in quotes for now, by remixing spell 51. How do these general features then apply to Pasher Ashaket's papyrus that I described at the beginning of this talk? Well, like the papyrus of Euefonk, the papyrus of Pasher Ashaket has spell 51, which is followed by spell 52, as you might expect. However, note that there is an additional passage found between the two spells. So you can see this highlighted in red on the screen. In between spell 51 and spell 52, we have this additional column of text, essentially at the end of spell 51. As Malcolm Mosher, in his edition that we talked about earlier, and others have already noted, this passage contains a section of text otherwise known from spell 42 of the Book of the Dead. If we laid out a simple identification of the passages then in sequence, it would seem like we have the interloper passage from spell 42, highlighted here in gold, interspersed between an otherwise typical Saite recension. However, it is important to remember in this context that Pasher Ashaket's papyrus skips many spells in the larger sequence. In Mosher's edition, he described the passage as, quote, inextricably moved from paragraph 6 of Book of the Dead spell 42 to here. However, this framing suggests that we must treat this passage as spell 42 rather than treating the entire section as a new version of spell 51. of course, because this passage from spell 42 comes right after spell 51, sort of connected to it at the end. The thing to remember here, and Malcolm Mosher already pointed this out, in fact, he sort of brought these all together, there are several reasons why this passage may have been placed here. First, it's not found only in Pasher Ashaket's papyrus, but a small group of manuscripts reliant on the same sources. If we remember that spell 51 was titled as Spell for Not Going Upside Down in the Divine Realm, then one reason this passage may have been added here was because it began, where is the sky, where is the earth? As you can see here on the screen, an appropriate symmetry for a spell for not going upside down, right? Asking where is the sky, where is the earth? So there's a content connection between this passage and spell 51. Furthermore, I hope by now it is obvious to you where my talk might be going. If spell 52 was a remixing of spell 51, why couldn't this interspersed section be a scribe's attempt at remixing spell 51 in yet another way? From this perspective, no longer is the appearance of this passage inextricable, because it is exactly through such remixing practice that the compositions were developed in the first place, as made immediately clear by the repetition of the entire spell 51 inside spell 52, right? Spell 52 is essentially already a remixed version of spell 51. So why can't this extra passage from spell 42, rather than we thinking of it as this extra passage, maybe it's just a remixed version of spell 51. Again, another attempt to elaborate and expand on the spell that was already there. So what I would like to do, and of course, this symposium is all about works in progress. And so I'm sort of trying to think through some of these issues myself. So I've turned to other areas of theoretical development to help me think through this. So using the ideas of assemblage theory and remix culture, we can therefore reorient our perspectives about how ancient Egyptian religious texts were created away from modern conceptualizations of original authorship and more to ideas of sharing, which are present in the collective practices of ancient text creation, right? That is, we're not looking at original authorship in a lot of ancient Egyptian religious texts, right? They're collective. They don't identify the authors often by name. Sometimes they're named as gods. So what we have is this sort of collective practice of scribes over long periods of times, adding and building up to this corpus. Now, I want to point out that the concept of assemblage that I'm using here is not necessarily that of Deleuze, Guattari, and Delanda. The problem with using that term directly was pointed out by Ian Buchanan in the book on the right, who noted that this problem can be seen in its application, the application of the term assemblage, in the social sciences, where there is an emerging emphasis on the process of assembling itself. This way of approaching the concept is only possible if one forgets or overlooks the fact that assemblage is a translation of agencement, right? So assembling in its practical sense of putting things together is very different than the agency that's behind the original French word. So the conceptualization of assemblage theory, with which I am working here for this paper, is by Johnson, Iola, and Selber. And they wrote a paper that was really focused on shifting views in teaching away from valuing traditional, let's say, originality in students' writings and focusing on problem solving through remixing, right? So they're trying to get away from the idea that if students use material from others, that somehow it's only plagiarism, right? I mean, of course, if they're using it without attribution, but they're sort of suggesting that the creative process of attributed remixing is just as valuable as, say, what we often consider original authorship, which in itself is somewhat problematic, as they pointed out. So I'm sort of starting from this paper. And here are some of the things that they discuss. So they challenge the idea that remixed assemblages of texts are, quote, essentially derivative. So they're pushing back on that. And they suggest that, quote, the distinction between original and existing fragments in a text is, if not meaningless, at least secondary, end quote. And they further note that, quote, to participate productively in culture, we must recognize that previous discourse always already shapes and constrains the activities of writers, that there is no neutral, non-regulated space from which to begin a writing activity. And we all know this as scholars, right? It's part of what we do as scholars. We're starting with our predecessors' work and we're sort of building on it. So this is basically what they're thinking about in terms of remixed culture. They're sort of acknowledging that we're never starting from a completely blank slate like the ancient Egyptian scribes. We have this other material out there and then we're putting that together. So their focus in the article is on context. And so what they say is, quote, understanding how the remixed artifact was redesigned for the new context, or for how the redesigned artifact is performing in that context. So they're really looking at how problem solving, how scribes or writers or students in their case solve problems through this remixing. So they're judging the final result on what sort of it's doing in its context, what problem it's solving in its sort of communication context, rather than judging it based on pure originality. So they conclude by reconfiguring their notion of creativity, which, quote, involves extensive research, filtering, recombining, remixing, and the making of assemblages that solve problems, end quote. So these types of actions are the very ones undertaken by scribes working with ancient Egyptian religious texts like the Book of the Dead. For those scribes, the goal was not original authorship in the modern sense, but rather conforming to notions of truth by contributing to the collective cultural lexicon that infused their society's belief system. In simpler terms, they sought to reinforce their cultural norms through creative research and writing. We should also note that this assemblage theory is not limited to the text only, but we can also apply it profitably to the remixing of layouts, the use of scripts, illustrations, and even materiality as well, right? So using papyrus or a coffin or linen, et cetera, et cetera. These are all parts of the templates that scribes and workshops had that they could remix depending on what they wanted to produce. If we then return to where we began, we see that ancient scribes often created assemblages like spells 51, 52. And in fact, this section of text, I should say, is repeated yet again in a spell that's been given the number 189. I'm not treating that spell in this talk, that's for future scholarship. But just to say that this kind of repetition is fairly normal. Of course, these assemblages, the ones we're looking at, spell 51, 52, and if you want to include spell 189, they developed from earlier assemblages, of course, like coffin text spell 203 and 772, as already noted by most of the major editions of the Book of the Dead, like Quirk and others. So rather than seeing the assemblage of passages as quote unquote inextricable, we should rather retool our frameworks, since such repetition and assembling were the norm. There are several sets of Book of the Dead spells that are repetitions. These are reflected in the Totem Books database here, as you can see, where they can only be looked up by their first occurrence. That is, if you look closely at the list, we have here spell 10, but note there's no spell 48. We have spell 11, but note there's no spell 49, and etc. That is, these have been designated by scholarship in certain cases as identical spells. So you just look them up under the number of their first occurrence. But of course, they got those numbers because, for example, they were in the papyrus of Uefunk that Lepsius numbered in 1842. So already in that papyrus, you had these repeating spells. However, only certain kinds of repetition have been treated in this fashion by scholars. So really for the spells that are nearly identical. So for example, in this list, 51 and 52, those spells are still listed separately, as are other spells that contain repetitions like Book of the Dead spell 2 and Book of the Dead spell 65 Lepsius. And I say 65 Lepsius because there's multiple 65s. You can also find spell 65 as numbered by Navi. So spell 2 and spell 65 Lepsius also have repeating text. In fact, almost the entire part of spell 2 is repeated in spell 65 Lepsius. Even though you have these overlaps between 51 and 52 or 2 and 65 Lepsius, they're not treated as exactly the same duplicate spells in the same manner as the ones that you see numbered on the screen here in the Totem Book project. Yet, this type of repetition is absolutely the norm. Going back to earlier corpora, such as the coffin text, for example, here on the inner and outer coffins of Jehudinot, several compositions are repeated, including the same compositions found on 4 separate occasions, through 3 copies of coffin text spell 93 and 1 copy of coffin text spell 152. Spell 93 and spell 152 are repeating spells in the larger coffin text corpus. They both contain the same text. In fact, I would argue they are the same text, and what we're seeing in these different numbers is just reception over time, right? Our modern numbering system disguises that, and I've talked about that in other conferences earlier this year. Here is another example, the coffin of Erie, which has 3 copies of coffin text spell 93, as well as many other repeated spells. And you can see them highlighted here in different colors on the screen. These facts raise the question of how ancient scribes delineated individual spells, a topic I have discussed in other conference papers recently. Suffice it to say that it is clear that the ancient scribes' conceptions of individual spells do not overlap perfectly with our own. So what can we take away then from this preliminary research in applying assemblage theory to the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead? Well, I think we can say a few things. Ideas from assemblage theory and remix culture can help us better understand some of the following. Ancient Egyptian sacred texts were part of a stream of tradition, I'm using Oppenheim's term there, by which scribes assembled and remixed ideas. Such remixing, including repetition, was the norm, and the resulting assemblages required the same rhetorical sophistication as any text. There I'm taking that from the words of Johnson, Iola, and Selber. Focusing on, quote, effect in context allows us to evaluate how an assemblage works, as in the case of Pasher Ashaket's papyrus that we discussed, rather than leaving us perplexed about a particular passage's placement. Recognizing assemblages among the Egyptian corpus does not replace other methods of writing, but was one valid practice among many. So for that, I would like to say thank you. I would like to thank the Getty, and in particular Sarah Cole, for allowing me the privilege of working on their Book of the Dead manuscript collection. And I would also like to thank the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures in Chicago for all their support. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All right, sorry, the mic is not working. Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. Foy, are you here with us? He is wonderful. So we will start with a few questions. Do we have any questions from those in the room? Could start here. I did have a question to get started. As you're talking about this mixing of spells or chapters, presumably that is changing some of the meaning to some extent of these spells. And that leads me to kind of a twofold question: is who is doing this meaning changing or this mixing, and why might they be choosing to change the meaning? Because presumably this is altering the way these spells are operating or being received.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I have to come to you from my phone because I had a little medical procedure this morning. So I'm actually in the parking lot of the hospital. But that's a great question. And what we find is that the meaning of the spells are being recast continually over and over across time. So in spells that you can track from the pyramid text, let's say on the early side, all the way to the books of breathing on the very latest side, you'll have punctuated periods where the spells are being recast, and they're being recast by the scribal priest, right? So the individuals who are in charge and able to read these archaic spells. And just to give you a couple of interesting examples of that, or some things to think about, we tend to theorize that the pyramid texts were originally written in the first person, but then they were transformed into the third person when they were actually inscribed on the walls of the pyramids. Many of those same spells in the coffin text were then recast back into the first person. And then many of those spells for the Book of the Dead were recast yet again into the third person. In particular, at the same time that the Book of the Dead is adding titles, and adding those notes of recitation, right? So recitation by so-and-so, the owner, which is probably a remixing or reworking itself of the Jed Medu that you find as a column heading in the coffin text. So to be specific to your question, it's clearly the sort of scribal priest of their time who are doing the remixing and sort of slightly changing the meaning. And they're recasting it for their audience. So this is one thing, I'm taking this from the work of Sarah Milstein, who worked on like the Hebrew Bible, for example, and looking at reworking there. And what you see when we look across let's call it the longue durée, the span of time that these texts are attested from, let's say the 24th century BC to the 2nd century AD, what we might see as competing viewpoints are actually just different recensions of the text for their time and place, right? So a scribe in the Middle Kingdom might have a different understanding or a different purpose in either reproducing or reading a spell than a scribe might have, let's say, in the late period. And so these scribes are recasting that then for their audience and for their readers and other scribes who are looking at these texts.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Thank you for that. Any other? Oh, yes, we do have. Let me bring you the mic.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a really good talk, and it kind of follows on from a presentation I went to yesterday, which was another Book of the Dead project. And they're looking at the variations, like you were saying, from all these different texts to kind of find common ancestors and like do a genealogy of these books. And the ones you were looking at were kind of like quite large additions. But I was wondering whether from your period and perspective, whether you would develop any omissions or whether it's purely continually adding onto these texts.
Oh, no, it's certainly omissions too. So I'll give you an example from some work that I've done on that. If you look at the first book of breathing, which it's first attested in the Ptolemaic period, the Egyptians gave this composition its own title, the first book of breathing. And we tend to recognize it as such as Egyptologists now. And it's sort of ironic that, let's say 50 or 100 years ago, scholars would look at a book of breathing and they would just call it a book of the dead. And that in the last, let's say 30 years, we've been trying to be more specific and say, no, this is the first book of breathing. This is the second book of breathing. We're using the Egyptian titles. But here's what's interesting. The first book of breathing is derived for sure from a running sequence of spells of the Saite Book of the Dead. And you can put the text right next to each other and it's clear that they're directly associated. Sometimes the spells are almost identical, or I should say the text, because in most copies of the first book of breathing, they edit out the spell titles. Some copies still keep them, but most copies, they omit the spell titles, but then they also omit a lot of other content. So to give you an example, when you look at that first book of breathing, you'll have material from, let's say, spell 15 of the Book of the Dead up to about spell 30 incorporated into the beginning of the Book of Breathing. And then they skip 12 spells from the Book of the Dead, and then you find material from spell 42. And so you might wonder, why would the scribes do that? What are they, why are they omitting that section? Because clearly the first Book of Breathing was developed by editing down this Saite sequence. Well, what you can see is that spells 31 to 41 are these apotropaic spells about, let's say, warding off snakes, warding off bugs, warding off crocodiles and things like that. But spell 42 has a really critical theological component. It has a whole section where the different body parts of the owner are associated with divine beings, right? So, your eyes are this goddess, your nose is that god, your teeth are the Ennead and things like that. So clearly omission is an incredibly important component to how the scribes are editing these texts. So yeah, I'm looking at sort of additions today in this talk, but certainly omissions are just as critical in how these spells are put together. And it's clearly also very conscious. It's not that the scribe just missed some section, but they're consciously omitting elements that they wanted to skip over.
Very interesting. Thank you. I think we need to, do we have time? Valentina, do we have any questions from the chat?
Yes, we have some questions, but first of all, I would like to thank you so much. And thank you also because despite your medical procedure, you are here with us. So thank you. We have some questions. I will read just one of those. Can remixing imply finite knowledge that is diluted through time and used without accurate religious/ritual application?
Can you read that just one more time? Let me hear that one more time. I want to make sure I understand it correctly.
Of course. Can remixing imply a finite knowledge that is diluted through time and used without accurate religious/ritual application?
Yeah, now I got it. Okay. I don't think I would frame it that way, because sort of like we were just talking about, certainly certainly all sort of knowledge of this material is finite, but in terms of dilution or inaccuracy, what we need to remember is that there's not one context or one purpose to any of this material. So for example, a lot of the ritual material in the Book of the Dead did not just apply to one ritual. It actually applies to many rituals. Parts of the opening of the mouth ritual applies in other contexts as well. So to think of it in terms of inaccuracy, to me, I think maybe misses a little bit of the point, because what we're looking for is, and I think assemblage theory in a way helps us think about this, is we're looking for how they're solving their particular problem in their context. So the rituals weren't consistent in every way. Of course, there was some consistency, but across time and place, there was a lot of variation, a lot of diversity. So I would be hesitant myself to view this in terms of being judged against, let's say, one accurate standard for what these spells meant, or the ritual that they were used in, or rituals that they were used in, because that's changing constantly over time. And I don't think necessarily the scribes and the priests were always just thinking about how was this done in the past and I need to recreate that. I think they were adapting all of that for their time and place. I think that's, when you take a bigger picture look at ancient Egyptian religious history, I think that's pretty clear. So I would be reluctant to see it as a dilution or as an inaccurate application. I'd rather sort of see what's effective and interesting for the particular adaptation at the time.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you again for your presentation. Can we get a round of hand?
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.